So to keep the ball rolling forward, we want to welcome Juliet Shoultz, and we are very, very thrilled to have her with us today to talk. She's going to be presenting remotely, but Juliet is with the Transportation or the U.S. Access Board, and she's going to be talking about something extremely important, something that we all know it's coming and part of the infrastructure that needs to be addressed, but it's going to be why is accessible EV charging so important? And just to give you a little bit of background on Juliet, Juliet is a transportation systems engineer with the U.S. Access Board, where she serves as a lead staff on accessible transportation. In her role, she develops accessible design guidelines that presents training and provides technical assistance on subjects including accessible public rights-of-way, transportation vehicles, passenger vehicles, and EV charging stations. She has 15 years of experience in transportation planning and engineering for state government and extensive experience with the Americans in Disability Act policy and standards development, as well as ADA transition planning. Juliet has been an active participant on Transportation Research Board standing committees and is a member of the National Cooperative Highway Research Program panels. Please welcome Juliet Shoultz.
Thank you. So I'm going to present to you why the need for accessible EV charging stations, what the Access Board's role is as far as accessible EV charging stations, what we've done so far, and what we are doing to continue to move this effort forward. So first, let's just kind of highlight why the need for accessible EV charging stations. On the slide, I'm showing data from the Department of Energy, and what they're indicating that there are roughly 50,000 public EV charging stations nationwide, with almost 127,000 charging ports across the country. Recently, about maybe more than a year ago, probably about 2 years ago, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was passed. And with that came a lot of funding that's designated for EV chargers. And the goal is to build out a network of over 500,000 EV chargers nationwide. And with that, we want to make sure that some of those EV chargers are accessible. With the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that included a lot of funding designated to EV charging. So there's the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, NEVI, with about $5 billion. There's discretionary grant program for charging and fueling infrastructure with over $2 billion. And also the installation of EV charging infrastructure is eligible under the US DOT Surface Transportation Block Grant Formula Program for funding there. So there's a lot of money that's being dedicated to EV charging stations, and the goal is to ensure that some of those EV charging stations are accessible. There is an obligation to provide accessible EV charging stations. So just to be clear, the current standards, the ADA standards and the ABA standards, which apply to federal facilities, do not address EV charging stations, but they do address components of EV charging stations that are required to be accessible. So for example, in the charger that has operable parts, so reach range comes into play, a clear floor space. So there are pieces of the EV charging stations that are already covered in the standards, even though the EV charging station in its entirety is not addressed in the standards. In terms of the obligation to provide accessible EV charging stations, any entity that's subject to the ADA, so that's your Title II, Title III entities, or the ABA, and that's any federal properties, must provide EV charging stations that are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. On this slide, I'm showing some of the entities that do have obligation to provide accessible EV charging stations. So this is if you provide EV charging stations, some of them must be accessible. So are your state and local government offices, public parks, municipal building parking lots, on-street parking. If the city is providing on-street EV charging stations, some of them must be accessible. Residential housing that's provided by state or local government. If you're providing charging stations there, some of them must be accessible. fleet charging stations used by the federal government, commercial fleet charging stations, as well as EV charging stations at highway rest areas. If you're providing EV charging stations along the highway rest areas, some of them do have to be accessible. So what the U.S. Access Board did, and it's part of our authority and mandate under the ADA, as well as under the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, those two acts mandate the U.S. Access Board to develop and maintain minimum guidelines to ensure accessibility and usability of the built environment. That includes EV charging stations. And so that's part of our mandate to make sure we're developing these minimum guidelines. I mentioned that the standards currently do not address accessible EV charging stations. So what we did in the interim is we developed design recommendations for accessible EV charging stations. We published these in 2022. And if you're not familiar with them, basically what we did in this document is, first of all, we highlighted the authority to develop these guidelines, and then also who's required to make sure they have accessible EV charging stations. And then we looked at the ADA standards and the ABA standards and our 508 ICT standards, Information and Communication Technology standards, and we pulled out pieces that apply to the EV charging station. So we looked at a parking space, we looked at operable parts, we looked at the IT parts of the EV charger itself, and developed technical assistance for, in the interim, until we have standards, enforceable standards, what can people do if they're putting EV charging stations in place to make sure that at least some of them are accessible. So this is a good document to use in the interim. We also have a recorded webinar on the design recommendations for accessible EV charging stations. And you can also reach out to us at the Access Board for technical assistance on how to make your EV charging station accessible. And we recognize even within the technical assistance document that when you have existing infrastructure, there will be some challenges. So for example, the location of your EV charging stations at an existing site will be dictated by the location of the utilities. So different things like that, where you have already built infrastructure and you're adding these EV charging stations in place. But there is still a way to make sure they're accessible to the maximum extent feasible, even within existing site constraints. So that's the technical assistance documentation. When we put that together, we considered two main things: accessible mobility features. So that's for people who need the physical access. Maybe they use a mobility device and they need to be able to get to use an EV charging station. What we did with the accessible mobility features, first we took your standard parking space, but we made it bigger because the inlet for the vehicle can be on the front side, back side, passenger side, driver's side. So we wanted to make sure the space is big enough so no matter what kind of electric vehicle you have, you can exit, deploy your ramp or lift to get out of your car, get around to the access aisle, to the EV charger, and get the charging cable back to your car. And I mentioned operable parts. Operable parts are already required by the ADA and ABA standards. So even though they don't mention EV charging stations, they do address operable parts. On the picture on the right-hand side, I'm showing the operable parts on the EV charger that are already required to be accessible. So basically any part on the EV charger that someone would interact with. The cable itself, of course. So anything that they interact with has to be within a 15-inch to 48-inch height above the finished ground. If you have any screens that have commercial or any information that a user is not interacting with, that can be placed above 48 inches. We also looked at communication features. And so I mentioned we pulled from our 508 Information Communication Technologies rule and pulled out requirements that are pertinent to making sure an EV charger has accessible communication features. And so here what we're talking about is accessible features for drivers of EV electric vehicles who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so the interface that they use on the charger needs to be accessible. Also, for example, on the slide I'm showing on the left-hand side, if you have a charger that indicates its status with maybe the color, um, you want to have an audible function as well, because there are people who are colorblind. So we really looked at all those communication features and try to address them in the way that it gives guidance on how to make these EV charging stations accessible to people with disabilities. So we published the technical assistance document back in 2022. But in the meantime, we've also been working toward final rule text. And this is language that we've been developing that once it's finalized, it will be added to the ADA standards and the ABA standards, and it will be enforceable under the ADA and the ABA. We published a notice of proposed rulemaking last month. So on September 3rd, we published the NPRM. So it's out for public comment. It's really important that you take a look at our proposed rulemaking and give us feedback. We do look at and actually are obligated to look at all the comments that we receive on our notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is slightly different from the technical assistance that we published in 22. In the technical assistance, we were making suggestions on, how many EV charging stations should be accessible, what the size should be. And so in the notice of proposed rulemaking, it's laid out more like our standards are. So this is likely what we will require. This is the close to the final step of what will be mandated under the ADA and ABA. So what happens is we have this notice of proposed rulemaking out. It's open for public comment. The comment period ends November 4th. Once that closes, we will look at all the comments, and those comments in part will inform what the final requirements end up being. So please comment on that rulemaking and give us your feedback. That's really all I have. If anyone has questions, the slide I'm showing my contact information, feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Juliet. Any questions for Juliet? This is an extremely interesting opportunity and why public comment is going to be so important moving forward. We obviously didn't have this opportunity when we were developing fuel pumps for ICE vehicles. We have this opportunity in front of us right now, and this is extremely important initiative by the U.S. government, U.S. Access Board. So I would highly recommend going in, commenting, looking at the rules, looking at what they're suggesting, because this is our opportunity to influence this. But any questions from anyone in the audience? Yes, hold on one second. Here you go, Charlie.
Hi, Juliet. This is Charlie Garnett from General Motors. I found the U.S. Access Board guidelines really useful in my job. I like this picture at the end because it kind of gets at something I've been thinking about. So this parking lot that's shown, there are maybe 4 EV chargers and 4 accessible parking spots. And there's kind of this Venn diagram where there's what is probably an EV charging spot and an accessible spot. And I'm wondering about, as a limited resource, especially in kind of these early days, how somebody who lays out a parking lot can kind of manage that so that if one user needs the accessible charging, and obviously it'd be great if they're all accessible charging spots. But they park there, they charge their car for potentially a long time, and somebody else is going to come up and need to use it. Do you have any thoughts about how that kind of plays out day to day, or how a parking lot designer, if that's a job, how that should be handled?
Yeah, and actually we discussed this in part in the technical assistance document, and look at the notice of proposed rulemaking because we have some discussion in there as well. Because there are several options, and it's one of those answers where it depends. How many EV charging stations are you offering? And then also what kind of site is it? Is it, for example, a mall where people might be there for, hours, really? Or is it a grocery store where they're not going to be there for more than 30 minutes to an hour? So you're looking at a combination of factors of what type of facility it is, how many spaces you're providing, And then our scoping in the notice of proposed rulemaking, we do make a suggestion to how many should be accessible based on what you're providing. So there's going to be several factors there in terms of how many of them are accessible. And really the thinking is if and when electric vehicles are more prevalent, then that's likely going to increase the need for more accessible EV charging stations. So there's different variables at play there.
I appreciate that. I think one of the things that happened at the GM Tech Center, where we do have a lot of chargers and tons of parking, because we have a lot of employees that are there, for 8 hours, typically. It was even just a matter of what signage should be put up. We know how to establish this as an accessible parking spot. We know how to say this is an EV charging spot. And it was kind of a matter of what sign do we put up, right? To tell people, like, you can park here until your car is charged, but please move during lunchtime or something. So it's a pretty simple thing to work out, I guess, but it boggled our minds for a few days there.
Yeah, and you'll notice in the technical assistance document, we talk about the use last approach, where you have use this one last. The challenge with the signage, and I think we'll all learn as everything rolls out, is there's the enforcement part of things, right? So let's say at an employee work site, there may not be an enforcement. It's probably more of a common courtesy, move your car when it's done charging. But in areas where enforcement might be an issue, there's also the learning curve around, if it's a use last, what does that mean to me as a driver? So I think we're all kind of in a learning phase in terms of, especially when it comes to signage, because if it's just the ISA symbol, that's understood by everyone that it's strictly for people with disabilities who have, the placard or whatever to use that space. But then when you go to these other variations, such as use last or use for 30 minutes only, then the enforcement piece also kind of gets mixed in there as well.
So I'm listening to this and wondering, if I have an autonomous vehicle, could I, come in, park, and tell it, go charge yourself whenever something is free? Has there been thought in the design of accessible charging places to have a connector that could be deployed automatically, that the car could hook itself up? Certainly an autonomous vehicle should be able to drive itself up close enough and position itself correctly if there was a connector that could be automatically deployed.
So now you're talking about the technical piece, and I live in the land of accessibility. So let the manufacturers, vendors, the inventors, the innovators come up with different EV charging station designs. And what my focus is on, how can we make those accessible? I've seen different variations of EV charging stations, but I can't really speak to the automation, especially when it comes to, like an autonomous vehicle parking in place and the EV charging component attaching itself. So I can't really speak to that part of your question. I can only speak to, once that's provided, we better make sure it is accessible.
Thank you, Juliet. I think what I've heard, quite frankly, is contactless EV charging, right? So just pull over a spot and it charges the vehicle. Maybe. And
I've seen some of those where it's underground. Basically, you pull up and it's under the car. But the technical functionalities of that, I'm not aware of how that works. But obviously, that would eliminate some of the concerns about operable parts, but you'd still have that access aisle, right? So that someone with a disability, with a mobility disabilities particularly, could pull onto that vehicle space. The charger would attach from underneath the car, but then they'd have the access aisle to get out of their car and go onto the site.
Thank you. Any other final questions for Juliet? Thank you, Juliet, so much for joining us remotely. We very much appreciate sharing the information, and we're encouraging everyone to go comment.
Please do. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet.